I sat frozen on my bedside, clutching onto my mother's suicide letter. These were the last words she'd left behind in this world, her final thoughts before departing forever. Her handwriting was erratic, a mess of jumbled words that hardly conveyed a proper meaning. It stood in stark contrast to the rest of the journal, which had been carefully written down, marking each event of her life. Then I began to read it over again, tears forming in my eyes and my heart weighing heavy. She'd never gotten to say goodbye, no final words exchanged between us, just 100 unanswered questions and a life I couldn't possibly understand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's all my fault. I've opened the gateway to a different world, a place no one was ever supposed to see. I brought them back, these monsters. I failed to stop it. I couldn't defeat them. All I ever wanted was to bring peace to those on the edge of life, to give them one final moment of happiness before they passed over to the other side. When I first realized I could bring them back from death, I was hailed as a miracle worker. But these aren't miracles. They're curses, monsters from another realm. These acolytes, they're not here to save us. They're taking over Tenebris, and they're using me to do it. I tried to stop. I tried to leave, but they won't let me. I can't escape. I can't get away from Tenebris. I'm sorry, but there's only one way to stop this. I need to die. I can't be responsible for more suffering. I'm going to end it the only way I can. May God have mercy on you all. Those were the last thoughts running through my mother's head as she left our world behind. A crazy rant I still couldn't believe. There wasn't any further closure, no message left behind for me. Just the scrambled words of a broken mind put down on a ripped-out page of the diary. I didn't know why she'd hidden it, or more importantly, whom she'd hidden it from. I wanted to call Sheriff Dawson and ask if my mother had truly lost it. But as I fumbled around for my phone, I realized it was gone. I'd probably dropped it somewhere in Riley's car. Without it, I could do nothing save wait for morning to roll around. That night, I didn't feel like sleeping. I just lay there in bed, holding onto the letter as I desperately tried to decipher what was going through her mind, how much of it was real, and why she hadn't tried to reach out during all the years before her death. Her diary provided few answers with so many of the pages ripped out. I needed to find them. I needed to know if there was any truth to her frantic rambles. But despite the overwhelming anxiety I felt about Tenebris, my eyes eventually started to wear heavy. Our bed felt cold, and the house was all too foreign, even with its familiar creaks and strange drafts of wind. It prevented my tired mind from simply slipping away. It was a bizarre sensation to be in a place filled with so many familiar artifacts and memories, but to feel as if I didn't belong. Alex, on the other hand, felt safe beside me. He was resting peacefully with his chest gently moving up and down to the rhythm of his breathing. To be that innocent and unaware of all the horrors in the world was an emotion I'd long since forgotten. I envied him right then that he was unfamiliar with my complicated past. I'd sheltered him from the horrors in the world that far, but I feared his innocence might not last for very long. There was something dark lingering in the air of Tenebris, and just the thought of having Alex beside me was worrisome one. Whether my mother was crazy or telling the truth, something was wrong about the town. I turned over in bed just to look at him, afraid he might vanish if I took my eyes off him for just a second. Alex was the last bit of family I had left, a part of myself that might still have a chance to enjoy all the beauty the world had to offer. I needed to protect him, to keep him safe. As I shifted in bed, Alex moved ever so slightly. At first, I thought I had woken him, but then he said something that sent shivers down my spine.
Mom, I don't like the crying man,
Alex mumbled, half asleep. I thought he had to be dreaming, but the words were so familiar. I put a hand on his head and brushed my fingers gently through his hair. He needed a haircut, that much was for sure. But those were priorities for a different time. It's okay, Alex. You're just having a dream. I uttered the words with such certainty, but then I felt the goosebumps rising on my arms. For an inexplicable reason beyond my understanding, I was afraid. Then I heard it. The distinct sounds of a grown man loudly sobbing. He was far away, I could tell that much, but between each cry, he seemed to be getting closer. His voice echoed down the empty streets outside. They rung through the air, filling it with unfathomable dread. It was just like what I heard back in the hospice care, back when I found Mr. Henderson in the basement. But the cries weren't ones of sadness, anger, nor fear. As a kid, I'd naturally connect sobs with negative feelings, yet there were no emotions hidden behind the crying man's calls. He simply sounded broken, and he was getting closer. I want to die again. It hurts to be here. Why am I here? He cried before briefly switching to a wet, hoarse laugh. He will come. You will be our vessels. Just like Mr. Henderson, he was talking to himself, alternating between twisted sobs and sickening laughter. I walked carefully over to the window, parting the curtains just to take a quick peek outside. Since we were on the outskirts of town, there were few street lamps to speak of. All I could see outside was the silhouette of a tall, twisted man wandering down the road. Where he'd come from and what he wanted, I couldn't tell, nor did I care to find out. Despite the darkness, I can tell he was hurt. His limbs had been twisted in unnatural directions, and he limped with bizarre steps, each seeming elongated as if controlled by invisible strings.
Mom? Who is that man?
Alex asked, finally awoken from the disturbing sounds. I don't know, was all I could think to respond.
Is he sad?
Strangely enough, Alex didn't seem afraid. He was rather filled with concern for the crying man on the street. I don't think so, I said. The sounds were bringing back memories I'd tried to repress for so long. All the nightmares I'd experienced in the past few months were all coming true. I'd always known they were more than mere dreams, but to hear the crying once again was too much.
Shouldn't we help him?
Alex asked. No, honey. Just stay in bed. There's nothing we can do for him, I said as I slowly closed the curtains. We just have to stay real quiet. Alex complied without asking any further questions. He'd always been good like that, at least with me. We just lay in bed, awaiting sleep to overcome our tired minds. The crying man slowly made his way further down the road, eventually fading away into the darkness as his voice got out of range. I let out a sigh of relief, and after another hour passed, I finally drifted off to sleep. I awoke to the sound of knocking on the door. Confused, I turned my face to the clock, only to realize the battery had died. I'd overslept, and Alex was still snoring next to me. During the course of the night, he turned 90 degrees in bed, lying across both mattresses with his face planted on the sheets. "Laura?" a voice called out from downstairs. "Sorry, the door was open. Are you ready?" It was Sheriff Dawson, ready to pick us up for the memorial. He was standing ready in the entrance hall, already dressed in his uniform. It was odd, as I could clearly remember locking the door the night before. Being paranoid about break-ins had hammered home that habit. Still, having the sheriff escorting me around made me feel a bit more at ease. Though it had been 20 years since I last saw him, I had nothing but fond memories of the man. He'd always been around at events and gatherings, making sure everyone got home safe, and never shied away from lending a helping hand. On top of it all, he just might have had answers regarding my mother. "Good morning, Sheriff," I said with a groggy voice. Alex tugged on my shirt, gesturing for me to bend down to his level.
He said to call him Morgan,
he whispered in my ear. I almost let out a chuckle, but I was too tired to truly appreciate his concern. "I'm sorry. The alarm seems to have died and we were kept up quite late. Up late? Did anything happen? I thought about it for a moment. It sounded all too surreal to even mention without seeming crazy. Well, there was a man outside. He was crying and screaming. The sheriff frowned. You heard all that, did you? He asked. I just nodded in return, surprised he knew what I was talking about. I'm sorry, Laura. There are a few disturbed individuals roaming around town. We're working on solving the problem, but I promise you, you're safe here. Alex went back to his room, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He'd already gotten dressed in a shirt formal enough for a memorial, but he needed to brush his teeth, a dangerous task when already dressed. I myself got ready in a hurry. We drove further into town together towards a hospice care I hadn't seen in years. How close were you to my mother, really? I finally asked the sheriff. Pretty close. We grew up in the same neighborhood. I was a bit older than her, even babysat her from time to time when we were both kids. She was a very special woman, your mother. It truly pains me to see her go. Do you know what happened to her? He looked over at me with a look of pity in his eyes. They didn't tell you? I took the suicide letter up from my pocket. Found this in the house. Sheriff Dawson sighed. Aggie was a great woman, but she was troubled. That much I can't deny, not that it was her fault. She didn't choose what she was given. I just never thought it would come to this. The town desperately needed someone like her. What do you mean, someone like her? I asked. Well, she was gifted. I'm not going to lie and say only good came from it, but she never meant anyone any harm. His words, though, clearly words of praise, didn't sit right with me. But before I could ask any further questions, Alex interrupted us with his own observations.
Where are all the people?
He asked. That was the first time I noticed just how empty the streets felt. Though Tenebris had always been a small town, it hadn't ever been lacking in terms of shops, kiosks, and crowded markets. It just seemed like everything had closed down, with the buildings run down and the population tired. Of the few people we actually saw, most looked so old as if there hadn't been a kid born in town for decades. Tenebris Care, however, was as polished as it had ever been. It was an old building with classic Victorian-style architecture. It stood in stark contrast to the semi-modern buildings in the rest of the town. All of them were so simple-looking, built only for their purpose and not to look good. An elderly woman stood outside the gates to the hospice care, ready to greet us. I instantly recognized her as the head nurse, Mrs. Marianne Crawford. She looked exactly the same as I last seen her 20 years ago, but she had to be in her late 70s by then. She gave a friendly smile as she approached the car.
You must be Laura,
she half-asked, half-stated. Her smile seemed only half genuine, which was still very unlike the stern woman I'd known growing up. She'd always been so strict then, never happy about me roaming the hallways or interacting with the patients. It's good to see you again, Mrs. Crawford, I said. I truly meant it. Though I never liked her, just seeing something familiar amid the eerie atmosphere was a welcome gift.
I'm so sorry about your mother. Agatha truly was a gifted woman.
The sheriff got a call on his radio and excused himself. I gotta take this. You have my number if you need me, Laura. With that, he went inside, ready to celebrate my mother's life. It would be the first time I'd set foot in the facility since I was a child. Not much had changed. The seemingly endless hallways were still only illuminated by the same ancient light bulbs, and the furniture looked identical. The entire place smelled of age, medication, and death. It wasn't a pleasant environment, but no place filled with death ever is. The only noticeable difference was the paintings. They used to be representations of religious scenes, but they'd been replaced by abstract art I couldn't quite put my finger on. They were dark red with pale lines running in every which direction through them. Just looking at them caused distressing emotions to arise, not something I would have imagined suitable for hospice cares. Mrs. Crawford led us down the hallways, helping us navigate to the main common area where we'd hold the ceremony. Last time I'd been here, the hallways seemed so full of life, an ironic observation in a place meant for death. But there had been whole families there visiting their loved ones and staff that tried their best to defeat the somber atmosphere. All that was gone now, and everything had fallen quiet. The building felt all too barren, rid of all life. "A bit quiet in here these days," I asked, trying to break the ice.
It's still the same old place you grew up in. Even most of the staff have remained the same. Not many young people are willing to up their roots and move to such a small town. It used to be a problem, but we're doing well enough these days.
She was right. The entire population was growing old. I would have assumed to meet many new faces upon my return, but I could recognize most of the nurses and doctors. They'd already seemed old to me as a kid, but there they were, 20 years later, as if not a single day had passed. Once we reached my mother's old ward, I felt a familiar dread in my chest. It was the same hallway that frequently haunted my nightmares. The memories of darkness, the basement at the end, and the hopeless crying. These were the thoughts that still lingered in the back of my mind. Then we passed my mother's guest room. It still had her name attached to it with rusted metal letters. Though it had never been our home, we spent an inordinate amount of time there. "Can I check out the room for a minute?" I asked.
After the ceremony,
Mrs. Crawford insisted. I thought it odd that the building had been designed in such a way that we had to traverse the entire facility just to get to the common area. It meant the family members had to cross a ward full of death just to get to the visiting section. I knew it was an old building repurposed for something greater, but it still bothered me. But before long, we finally got to the ceremonial room. There were about 24 people there already, seated without speaking a word. They stared at us as we entered, but still didn't greet us, nor further acknowledge our presence. So many people, all there to pay their respects to my mother, and I still felt out of place.
"Please, take a seat,"
Mrs. Crawford said as she pointed to a couple of chairs. The guests kept staring at us as we sat down in our designated seats. I could recognize a few of them. They'd been patients needing end-of-life care, but that was 20 years earlier. The fact that they were still breathing seemed beyond the realm of possibility. I tried to convince myself that they were just family members that looked the same, and that the memory of a 7-year-old wasn't a reliable one.
"Everyone stay seated. We will begin shortly,"
Mrs. Crawford said as she took her place at the front of the room. For a moment, she just stood there in silence, almost seeming to savor the moment. Then a couple of people dimmed the lights and lit candles made from red wax. The light they produced reminded me of the paintings in the lobby, causing the same dread I'd felt as I entered the building. Once the room was sufficiently dark, it felt as if I'd left my childhood home and entered a new world I couldn't recognize. The people around me, even those I knew before, suddenly turned to strangers. Their faces didn't change, but the aura surrounding them was completely off. I grabbed Alex's hand in panic, only snapping back to reality as he winced from the squeeze.
"Ow! Let go of my hand!"
he demanded. Alex didn't seem to find the strange atmosphere in the room. Despite the fact that not a person had uttered a single word apart from Mrs. Crawford, I couldn't stand the silence.
"Today we honor Agatha Florence,"
Mrs. Crawford said, finally breaking the deafening silence. "Today we honor Agatha Florence," the crowd repeated.
"She was our Nephilim, the gift to the acolytes."
Again, the crowd repeated what Mrs. Crawford said.
"She granted new life among death. For that, she will be remembered."
I looked around me, not sure whether to partake or just observe the events unfolding in the room.
Life is a frail thing, a fact well known among humans. We shall not fall into that trap. We will be strong.
The people kept repeating each and every word she spoke, but following that last sentence, she changed to a language I didn't understand. To me, it sounded Latin or Greek, but I didn't have enough linguistic skills to say for sure. They all chanted different phrases, but one kept repeating, "De morte ad vitam, de morte ad vitam, de morte ad vitam." It went on for a couple of minutes before silence suddenly filled the room. I sat in both awe and nervous anticipation, wondering what would come next. But no more chants were called out. Instead, they just kept sitting there for minutes on end with their eyes closed. Alex had also started to look afraid. He squeezed my hand hard, but despite the bizarre events occurring before us, it didn't seem like we were in any immediate danger. Then, as quickly as it all begun, it ended. The room remained silent, and the candles started to extinguish themselves, having burned little more than 15 minutes. The smell they left behind was unfamiliar, a scent I couldn't readily identify. It was akin to the smell of a room that had been freshly cleaned out after the passing of a patient, a mixture of death and soap that not even time could wash away. Mrs. Crawford started heading towards the exit, and the rest of the crowd finally stood up, still not speaking freely. I basically ran over to stop her, hoping to get some answers. She turned as she saw me try to navigate the mass of people, almost stumbling over.
Miss Florence, how did you find this ceremony?
I didn't want to be callous, but I couldn't just let the strange chanting slip by. What exactly was that? I asked, a bit ruder than intended.
I understand this might all seem foreign to you. That is one of the reasons why I wanted you to come. You need to know just how important Agatha was to this community. Her gift, her ability to save bodies so close to death, is something rarely heard of in this world. I will explain it all to you, but only once the time has come. You need to be ready first.
Once I'm ready for what? I began to ask, before I realized Alex had vanished from his seat. I had only taken my eyes off him for a second, but that was enough to let him vanish out of sight. "Alex?" I called out. Then I turned back to Mrs. Crawford. "Did you see where my son went?" She shook her head. I quickly scanned the room for him before I rushed to the door, exiting to the hallway. Even there, Alex was nowhere in sight. "Alex!" I called out again as adrenaline rapidly built up in my blood. The people had all left the room, but hadn't entered the same hallway as myself. It was eerily quiet, and I couldn't decide which direction to run. Then I heard something echoing through the empty halls. A child's laugh. It was coming from the direction of the basement, and I instinctively knew Alex had gone down there. I started running towards the sound of laughter. It wasn't a natural one, the kind you expect from children playing around. It was hollow, just like the crying. It sounded like someone faking emotion, but not being able to put proper emphasis on the right places. The door to the basement was wide open, showing little more than a void of darkness inside. I rushed towards it, calling out for Alex, but my calls were drowned out by the laughter of emotionless children. But before I could even reach the basement door, a large figure came running out towards me, carrying Alex in his arms. It was Sheriff Dawson, who'd returned from his call just in time to grab my son. "Laura, what happened?" I asked.
I'm sorry, Mom,
Alex said.
I just wanted to play with the children.
The sheriff gave me a concerned look. "I'm sorry, Laura. I saw your kid go into the basement. I just went down to bring him back. They're quite strict about allowing people in there." By then, the commotion had caught the attention of Mrs. Crawford, who came over to check what was going on.
I'm sorry,
Alex repeated. I held my arm around him as I looked questioningly at Mrs. Crawford. "Sorry, I only took my eyes off him for a second. He doesn't usually run away like that."
It's all right, Mrs. Florence. Did he go into the basement?
I nodded. She then redirected her attention towards Alex, who was clutching onto my leg.
What did you see down there?
She asked firmly. Alex was too nervous to respond. "I caught him just as he had descended the staircase. Just let it slide, Marianne," Sheriff Dawson interjected. Mrs. Crawford wore a stern expression on her face, just like I remembered her as a child. But it didn't seem plain strict, but almost malicious in its intent. "What exactly is down in the basement?" I asked.
That's not for you to ask at this time. Whatever is down there belongs to us.
I looked pleadingly at the sheriff, hoping he'd help me out. Instead, he just shook his head, gesturing for me to let it go. I obliged without further questions. I felt afraid, but it had definitely been children laughing from down in the basement. I was starting to realize that Tenebris might not be safe anymore.
Let us just move on. I'll show you to your mother's old room.